Hi, everyone. So in my time here at COA, I've studied a lot of different classes and I've been interested in a lot of different things. But the recurring theme of my studies has been that I've been interested in issues of oppression and injustice, particularly at the global level. So I've taken classes in a lot of different areas, in politics, of course, but also in anthropology, economics, ecology, and law. Over the past few years, I've become more and more interested in law because I find it a really fascinating perspective through which to explore the issues that interest me. And what I like so much about law is that I think a lot of the time it goes kind of unquestioned or it's assumed to be neutral, but law is a structure that's constructed out of a very explicit set of rules that carry with them an implied set of values, implied norms. And so even though law appears to be neutral, it does actually have some ideological bias. It has values embedded within it. And so what that means is that law interacts with social actors in particular ways, or it affects social processes in an unexpected manner sometimes. And so what I wanted to look at was how ideology is embedded within some aspect of law that usually goes unquestioned. I decided to focus on international law because it's the area that I have the most experience in. So prior to doing my senior project, I did a literature review, and I looked at similar studies in this area in terms of ideology and bias within international law, and I found out a lot of interesting things. So I found out that countries with less political power or less economic power are likely to be disadvantaged, and also that big discursive concepts tend to be linked to a very particular cultural context that isn't necessarily relevant to everyone participating in international law. But I wanted to look at something new. I wanted to apply a theory to international law that hadn't been applied before, and so I decided to look at language. I wanted to explore the role that language plays in international law and see what its function is and how it's understood. I focused on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I've attended one of their conferences 2 years ago. It's called the UNFCCC for short. That's the only acronym I'll be using, so if you hear me using an acronym, it's that one. And it was signed in 1992. Almost all of the world's countries are signatories, and it aims to combat anthropogenic climate change. And it does this by meeting once a year. All of the countries come together and they negotiate new laws every year to try to combat climate change and find solutions. So the theory that I decided to apply to the UNFCCC was the theory of language ideology. And what the theory of language ideology suggests is that different people have different language ideologies, and a language ideology is an understanding of how language functions. So each person has a slightly different understanding of how language works. And so while this varies between individuals, language ideologies are also very strongly linked to context, so different cultures will likely have different language ideologies, and also to language. The language that you speak heavily influences the way that you understand language to function. So one example of a language ideology is a referential language ideology. And this is one of the most commonly discussed ideologies. And it's linked very strongly to a Western intellectual tradition, starting in the Enlightenment with the philosopher John Locke, who talked a lot about reason, and he saw language as the potential vehicle to create reason and rational conversation between men. And so what a referential language ideology does is that it understands language to be completely neutral, as if it's a transparent vehicle for meaning that communicates and transmits meaning very clearly between one person and another, with language not adding any additional meaning to it. So if I say something, it will be understood in exactly the same way as if someone else had said it. And one example of this is reading comprehension exercises in primary school. So children are given a text and they're told to explain what meaning the text has. But what such an exercise implies is that there is only one meaning within a text, or only certain correct meanings within a text, or with any kind of language, and that everyone should be able to access or extract that meaning out of a text. And so a referential language ideology understands language to be separate from context and to be universally accessible. The main critique of a referential language ideology comes from the idea of indexicality. And the word indexicality refers to indexes, which are registers of social meaning that link context to language. And so what an indexical understanding of language suggests is that actually language is completely dependent on context to have meaning. It can't be divorced from context because all the meaning that we transmit through language is dependent on the context within which we are functioning. So one example of this, which I think is quite powerful, is there was a study done in the 90s of courtrooms in the US, and it looked at what they called powerless language. And what this powerless language was that most women, except for very highly educated women, and a few men, ones with exceptionally low levels of education, used powerless language which combined a variety of features, but one was hedge words, so things like kind of or sort of, or maybe. So instead of saying it was at 6 o'clock, they were like, I think it might have been at 6 o'clock. Or intonation, so there would often be a rising intonation as if they were questioning it. So instead of saying it was at the park, they would say it was at the park. And so things like this made them appear less reliable to jurors. And what was found was that people who used this kind of powerless language was seen as less reliable, and actually their cases were much less successful. So I think, yeah, that illustrates how language itself adds meaning. Even if they could have, so those people could have been saying exactly the same thing that a highly educated man would have been saying, but because they were saying it in their particular way, they were interpreted differently. The meaning extracted out of that was very different, with very real consequences. So applying this theory to the UNFCCC, I looked at many different aspects of the UNFCCC, but I don't have time to go into all of them now. So I'm going to look at one example, which is translation. So, of course, the United Nations is an international organization, and there are people who come from all over, and so they have to translate into different languages. So while they're negotiating the new laws every year, there is instantaneous live translation into the 6 languages. There are headsets you can pick up, and you can tune into whatever language you want. And then after the negotiations are over, the official documents are also translated into the 6 official UN languages. But what this act of translation implies is that one word can be considered fully equivalent to another word. It's not that a word that's proposed in one language is given full context and explained in another language, but rather one language is assumed to be exactly the same as in another language. And this is very reflective of a referential language ideology, because the meaning of words is linked to the cultural context and also to language itself. And so a word within one language can never be fully encapsulated by another word in another language. It needs to be explained much more. And so the idea within the UNFCCC that translations are that simple and that easy is heavily reflective of a referential language ideology. So I looked at different aspects of the UNFCCC, and overall I concluded that it does have a very strong tendency towards a focus on reference and referentiality. So why does this matter? Well, as I said before, a referential language ideology is very strongly linked to the West and to a Western intellectual tradition. So because the UN is an international space, ideally, all the actors would be able to participate on equal footing, and they would be able to communicate with each other. So the fact that there's a bias towards any one culture is already worrying. But with a referential language ideology, it's particularly dangerous because it claims to be neutral, and so it actually erases its own bias. It doesn't proclaim that it has values. Also, the dominance of Western thought is reflected in other trends in international law. So, for example, the legal processes within international law are very reflective of a Western tradition in law, and also large concepts such as environment or development are again very linked into a Western tradition. And so there's a recurring theme that I hope my senior project in some small way contributes to, of a dominance of Western thought within international law. And then taking this within the context of climate change, the West again comes out as very dominant. So historically, the Western world has had much higher emissions than everyone else, and they continue to today have extremely high emissions, and they should be decreasing their emissions, but they are not decreasing them as quickly as they should be. And so there's a dominance in international law of the West, intellectually and linguistically, but also environmentally, and in terms of the environmental impact that they have. So my next steps, I will be working as a research assistant in a legal center for environmental law for 1 year. I will also be attending the UNFCCC conference in December, which I'm very excited about. And after that, I will be pursuing graduate studies in law. Thank you.